So for this video, I'm finally getting around to doing an updated version of my Stephen King ranking list. And in this video, I will be ranking every Stephen King book in one video. I know you guys have been patiently awaiting this video, and I've finally gotten around to actually finalizing my list. And I know you guys are very excited to see what has changed and what hasn't changed. And there are some definite changes to my ranking list. And if you guys haven't seen it before, I will link down below in the description box my ranking series that I did, where I did a 10-episode series where I ranked all of Stephen King's books. Now, that was about a year and a half ago, I think. Man, time flies. And yeah, there are a lot of changes that I've made to the list. And also, 3 new Stephen King books have come out since then. Gwendy's Final Task, Fairy Tale, and Billy Summers. So you guys will get to see where those fall on the list. And you know what? Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the list. Starting off with number 78, easily my least favorite Stephen King book, and it's in fact the only Stephen King book I've never been able to finish. I've DNF'd it several times, and this is going to come as no surprise to most of my subscribers. That would be Black House, written by Stephen King and Peter Straub. This is the sequel to The Talisman, which, surprise, is number 77 on the list. I don't like these books, and they're easily my least favorite things that Stephen King has written. And yeah, will I ever get around to finishing Black House? Probably, but I am definitely not excited for it. Number 76 on the list is Dance Macabre, which is actually Stephen King's nonfiction book. I don't really enjoy it because it's very scholarly and very dry. I thought I was going to like it because it's all about horror fiction and movies, but it was just incredibly boring, incredibly dry. I'm probably never going to reread it again. And number 75 on the list is Rage, easily my least favorite Richard Bachman book. Even though it has no supernatural elements, it's one of the hardest Stephen King books to suspend my disbelief for, because a lot of stuff that happens towards the end of the book is just completely unrealistic to me. I really don't like this, and I reread this recently. I probably will never reread it again. It's bad. Number 74 on the list is Elevation, a newer Stephen King novella. Really don't like this one. The characters are all bland, and he basically reuses the premise in Thinner and just makes it a lot dumber. There's really not like a clear conflict in this book, and there's not a lot of tension. It's very boring. Easily one of my least favorite Stephen King novellas. Number 73, End of Watch, which is the third and final book in the Bill Hodges trilogy. Now, the other 2 books are going to be much higher on the list, and this one is easily my least favorite in the trilogy, because the first 2 books, while they're grounded in reality, the third book adds a completely weird and unnecessary and stupid supernatural element, and I really didn't like the direction that this book went in. Easily my least favorite in the Bill Hodges trilogy. Number 72, Lisey's Story. This is Stephen King's favorite novel, but it's definitely not one of my favorites. Kind of a promising premise, but the characters aren't all there for me, and their lovey-dovey language gets on my nerves, really grinds my gears. And again, a theme for like these bottom lists, or the bottom books on this list, a very weird and really unnecessary supernatural element. It doesn't really add much to the story. He could have written the story without that, and it would have been better. But yeah, as it is, this is definitely one of my least favorites. Number 71, Cell. And I recently reread this book because I was curious on whether or not I would like it more the second time. I did not. Pretty cool premise of like cell phones causing like a zombie apocalypse, but the characters aren't very memorable. And overall, this book is just not very memorable. And the ending is very lackluster. Definitely one of Stephen King's most subpar books. Number 70 is Gwendy's Final Task. And just for Easter egg, I'll throw in Gwendy's Magic Feather, even though this is solely written by Richard Chismar. Both of these kind of ruined my experience for Gwendy's Button Box, which used to be one of my favorite Stephen King novellas. But the continuation of Gwendy's story just really did not work for me. Gwendy's Final Task, while it is slightly better than Magic Feather, it was very disappointing. Even though it had some cool Dark Tower elements, overall very lackluster, and I really don't see the need to ever reread this again. Number 69, Sleeping Beauties. Now, originally this was a little bit higher on my list, but as I've thought about it, even though I enjoyed this the first time that I've read it, I've forgotten nearly everything about it except for the premise, which is inherently a cool premise, but the second half of the story really didn't do it for me either. And just the fact that I can't remember that much about it, it's definitely tanked a lot lower on the list. Number 68 on the list, we have Insomnia, which I actually think is one of Stephen King's most overrated books. Even though a lot of Stephen King fans haven't read this one necessarily, the ones that have usually end up loving it. I did not. I didn't really love the main character. I did enjoy the Dark Tower connections, but I need a bit more than that to enjoy a story. And it's overly long, and it's just not one of my favorites. Number 67, Storm of the Century. And while this is admittedly a good story, the book itself is literally just a screenplay of like what's in the actual miniseries. So I'm probably never going to reread this again. If I want to enjoy the story, which it is a good story, I'll just go back and watch that 2000s miniseries again. And number 66 on the list, we have The Tommyknockers. And a kind of a running theme with Stephen King's chunkier books is that part one is usually pretty good, and part one in here is pretty interesting and entertaining. Part two is usually a slog and way too long, which it definitely is in this one. And then part three, it all kind of depends on how it ends and how it all wraps up. And it's kind of lackluster. The Tommyknockers, great start, but overall, a very meh Stephen King chunker. Number 65, we have Bag of Bones. And while this is one of my least favorite Stephen King books, I am interested to go back and reread it just because so many people cite this as being one of their favorite Stephen King books. So I do want to go back and reread it. So that's why it's a little bit higher on the list, even though I don't have very good fond memories of this book. Number 64, we have Cycle of the Werewolf. And the main reason why this is actually lower is because it's too short, which is not usually a complaint I have with Stephen King. But it's kind of like a novella, and it's kind of a graphic novel, and I just wish it was longer. I think it would have actually made a very cool Richard Bachman novel. But what we do get in here is pretty cool, and it's got an interesting structure and premise, but overall, it's just not one of my favorites how it's written. Number 63, Rose Matter, A Tale of Two Halves. This book starts out incredibly. I love the main character and the story in it. But the second half, again, he shoehorns in a supernatural element that I think is dumb. And the ending is not very good. I love the first half, but the second half definitely drops it down on the list significantly. Number 62, we have Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which we recently just finished for the Stephen King Short Story Book Club. If you want to go check that out, shameless plug. And I did enjoy it slightly more than I did the first time, but overall, this is still easily my least favorite short story collection from King. There's a few gems at the beginning of it, but most of it is just either boring, forgettable, or just bad. Number 61, we have The Institute. And while the first chapter of this book is amazing, it's like the first 40 pages, after that, I kind of wish we went back to that main character that was in the first chapter. The rest of the book is fine. King obviously does a good job with kid characters. The ending, however, is very weird and kind of hard to wrap your head around. I didn't really love it. Number 60, we have From a Buick 8. And while I did enjoy this book at the time, the reason why it's significantly lower on the list is because of its repetitive nature. Something interesting happens like a few times in this book, but I think it would have been more impactful if it would have just happened once. And I think it would have been a much better Stephen King novella. Number 59 on the list, we have Fairy Tale, Stephen King's newest release. And while the first third of this book was excellent, the last half of the book, once the portal fantasy stuff actually starts happening, was very lackluster. I did not care about any of the secondary characters, and it just fell flat for me. So that's the main reason why this book is so low on the list. I wanted to love it, but I couldn't. I'll probably get grilled in the comments for these next two books that I'm about to put this low on the list. But just remember, this is all subjective, and it's my opinion, and none of this really matters. Number 58, we have 11/22/63. And while I do really enjoy the premise, and I really enjoyed kind of the first third of this book and how awesome it is, really the middle chunk of this book and kind of the romance side plots that happen, I really didn't care for. And the ending, it was fine. Overall, it was a good book, but vastly overrated. And if you haven't clicked off yet, you might want to now, because this might hurt a lot of constant readers' feelings, but it's how I feel. Number 57, we have The Stand, the uncut version. And again, I love the first third of this book. It's exactly what I wanted the book to be. And then the rest of the book was just a boring slog to get through. And while the characters themselves were good, what was happening around them, I just did not care for. One of the worst Stephen King endings, and just overall, vastly overrated, just like 11/22/63. You guys are also probably going to kill me for putting this book above those two books. But again, none of this matters. Number 56, we have Dreamcatcher. And I actually think this book is underrated. I know a lot of people would put it in their bottom 5 or even their worst, but I actually enjoy it, especially part 1. It's just classic Stephen King character work, interesting premise, and again, it is a bit on the chunky side, and the middle section does get a bit tedious, but I actually enjoy this book. Number 55 on the list, Hearts in Atlantis. Now, originally I had this book much higher on my list, but it's fallen significantly just because I've reread the first 2 novellas in here. They're not quite as good as I remember them being, and also just the structure of the novel. It's a mosaic novel. It's got novellas and short stories that are kind of interconnected at the end. I really don't enjoy the short stories at the end, so overall, just not a book that I am looking forward to rereading that much. Number 54, we have 4 Past Midnight, which is easily my least favorite Stephen King novella collection. I usually love Stephen King novellas, and while the first 2 novellas in here are very good, The Langoliers and Secret Window, Secret Garden, the last 2 in here, very lackluster. The Library Policeman is so silly, and The Sundog, while it's got an interesting premise, it takes so long to get to it. Overall, my least favorite Stephen King novella collection. Number 53, we have Mr. Mercedes, the first book in the Bill Hodges trilogy. This one is an interesting case of Stephen King actually having a very compelling plot, and the plot kind of moves the story forward, but he kind of forgets to have compelling characters. Number 52, The Wind Through the Keyhole, Dark Tower Book 8 or Book 4.5. Either way, this is now actually my least favorite Dark Tower book. And it used to be Wolves of the Kala, which you'll see in a little bit here. But yeah, I've reread this now, and while I enjoyed it the first time, the second time, I liked it significantly less. Number 51, we have The Running Man, another Richard Bachman novel. And besides Rage, this is like my least favorite of the ones that are good. And again, kind of like Mr. Mercedes, a very propelling plot, but none of the characters are stellar. It is a good, fast-paced Stephen King book, which is rare, but overall, it is one of my least favorite Richard Bachman books. And number 50 on the list, we have Wolves of the Kala, which I was just mentioning. This is Dark Tower Book 5. This used to be my least favorite, but upon a reread, I did enjoy it slightly more. It is still one of my least favorite Dark Tower novels, just because of the middle section. Like, someone that I don't really care that much about is giving their backstory. It goes on forever. The rest of the book, however, is pretty good. However, it's still one of my least favorite Dark Tower novels. Number 49, we have On Writing, which is another Stephen King nonfiction book. And while this is actually a very good book, and the first half is sort of like his memoir, I love the first half. The second half is more about Stephen King's kind of writing advice. And while the first time I read this, I was very much interested because I was writing a bunch of short stories. Reading it for a second time, it didn't really do much for me, but I do love the first half of the book, which is all memoir. This next book, it's kind of hard to fathom that I'm putting it this low on the list, but I really couldn't justify it being much higher, and that would be Under the Dome for number 48. And while I loved the first, 900 or so pages of this chunker, it just flew by, and it was so good, great characters. I really can't justify the ending, and the ending is one of the main reasons why I don't really want to go back and reread it, so I can't really put it that much higher. All right, let's continue to make people more upset. Number 47, we have Pet Sematary, another one of Stephen King's most overrated books. I know a lot of people absolutely love this book, and they think it's terrifying. For me, I have a lot of significant problems that I can't really go into spoiler-free. I do have a spoiler review for this book, so if you want to learn more about why I don't love this book, go check that out. But just know that I do think it is one of his most overrated books. Number 46, we have The Long Walk by Richard Bachman, and this really surprised me when I was redoing my list, because this used to be my second or third, probably second favorite Richard Bachman book, and it fell off significantly after a reread. The first time I read this, I absolutely loved it. It was near my top 10, but the second time, I just really didn't love it as much. Number 45, we have Joyland, which is a pretty good book. Not necessarily one of my all-time favorites. There's not really anything I would necessarily change about this book, not really any real complaints. It's just, there's a lot better Stephen King books that I enjoy. There's not much that I just absolutely love about this book, but it's a solid Stephen King book. Number 44 on the list, we have The Bizarre Bad Dreams. And while I didn't really enjoy it that much at the time, I think it's because I read it right after finishing Night Shift, which is usually one of my favorite Stephen King short story collections. This is very different from Night Shift, so I'm definitely looking forward to rereading it to see how much I enjoy it more or less. I'm just very excited to reread it. That's why it's a little higher on the list. This next one is just very sad. Number 43 is Gwendy's Button Box. Now, originally when I did my list, this was much higher. It was one of my all-time favorite Stephen King novellas. But like I said previously in this video, Gwendy's Magic Feather and Gwendy's Final Task really just poo-pooed my enjoyment of this novella. And I really think this should have just been a standalone. So unfortunately, this has fallen significantly on the list. Number 42, The Dark Half. Another book that's kind of fallen off the list. I think this was in like the 20s in my original ranking. This book, while it is great and it has a really goofy premise that I love, the main reason why it's fallen significantly is its repetitive nature. Kind of a few things kind of repeat itself in the book. I think it could have been a little shorter, a little tighter. And while it does have one of my favorite Stephen King endings, the repetitive nature does keep it a little lower on the list for me. Number 41, we have The Dark Tower, which is book 7 and the conclusion to the Dark Tower series. And while I absolutely love the very ending to the story, there's a lot of moments in this book that are just very anticlimactic and that kind of go on for a long time. There are great character moments, and like I said, the ending is great, but overall, it's a little lackluster, and a lot of things I didn't love about this one keeps it a little lower on the list. Number 40, we have Everything's Eventual, which is another Stephen King short story collection, and this is the one that we're currently doing for the Stephen King Short Story Book Club. Another shameless plug. And yeah, this, while it's not like a top tier Stephen King collection, it is a solid collection, and I do really enjoy it. Number 39 on the list, we have The Gunslinger. While I do really enjoy this book, and it does get better upon a reread, there's just more Dark Tower books that I actually just enjoy more, so look forward to that on the list. But yeah, the number 39, we have The Gunslinger. Number 38, we have Gerald's Game. Now, I love Stephen King horror stories and novels that are kind of more on the realistic side. And this is definitely one of those cases where a woman is literally handcuffed to a bed and she can't get out and she has to figure out how to do so. Really great premise and really good execution. The ending does go on a bit longer than it probably should, but overall, a great Stephen King novel. Number 37 on the list is It, which again is one of King's most overrated books. Although I do still enjoy it, I do give it 4 stars. I know a lot of people give it 5 stars, but I do have some complaints. I love the characters and I love the story. The pacing is a little wonky. I think it could have been easily a couple hundred pages shorter. Also, the ending isn't very good for a lot of reasons. Number 36, we have Desperation. And I think originally on my ranking list, I had this significantly lower, but now it's significantly higher after a reread. And I really did enjoy it much more the second time around. I enjoyed how bonkers it was. I even enjoyed the characters a little bit more. I do, however, enjoy the companion novel, The Regulators, slightly more, but I'm glad that I gave Desperation a second shot and I liked it slightly more. Number 35 on the list, we have The Green Mile. And while this is a near perfect novel and it's excellent with great characters, great story, the main reason why it's a little lower on the list is because I do enjoy the movie more. So it's not a book that I want to go back to reread a whole lot. In fact, I've only read this book once. If I want to enjoy the story, I would just go watch the movie. Number 34 on the list, we have Salem'S Lot, which is Stephen King's second published book, his vampire novel. I don't usually love vampires, but Stephen King basically takes Dracula and puts it in a small Maine town. Very good, very creepy, maybe slightly overrated because I know a lot of people put it in their top 5 or top 10. I think it's pretty good, 4 stars. It's solid. Again, I don't love vampires, but Stephen King does an excellent job with this one. Number 33 on the list, we have Skeleton Crew. Definitely one of his better ones. And while there are a lot of just bangers in this one, just a lot of top tier Stephen King short stories, it also has a few that are some of his worst. Like there's some poems in here that are kind of crap, and there's some other ones that just not a lot of people enjoy, especially me. But overall, there is so much goodness in here that it had to be a little higher than some of the other collections. Number 32 on the list, we have Christine. I love this book. The only thing I don't love about this book is that it's written in 3 parts, and it's kind of got a weird character shift perspective deal. Like some of this book is told in first person, and some of it's told in third person. It's kind of a weird structural style, but overall the story itself is great. Excellent characters. Definitely one of his better novels. Number 31 on the list, we have Wizard and Glass, Dark Tower Book 4. Now, I've read this book, I think 2, maybe 3 times now at this point. I've liked it slightly less. I think originally I did give it 5 stars, but the second time around, or the third time, I gave it 4.5 stars. Still very good, still one of the best Dark Tower novels, but it does kind of linger too much towards the middle section. But overall, great character work, and just the Dark Tower is awesome. Number 30 on the list, we actually have The Shining, which I know might surprise some people because this is just one of Stephen King's most iconic books. And I loved the book the first time I read it. Absolutely loved it. Each time I've reread it, though, I've liked it significantly less. And funny enough, I keep liking Dr. Sleep, its sequel, even more, so you'll see that later on the list. But The Shining is a classic for a reason. Still a terrific Stephen King novel. Number 29 on the list, we have The Girl Who Loves Tom Gordon, an underrated book for many reasons. This was actually the very first Stephen King book that I ever read, and I didn't really appreciate it that much. But now, reading the book as an adult, it's much more terrifying knowing what this child is actually going through, like getting lost in the woods and having all this crap happen to her. The only thing I don't love about this book is all of the baseball stuff. If it didn't have that, it probably would have been much higher. But overall, still a fantastic little Stephen King book. Number 28, we have The Regulators, which is the companion novel to Desperation, which you saw earlier on the list. I think this is one of Richard Bachman's and Stephen King's most underrated books. I love this book. I love how bonkers it is. It's such a thrill ride throughout the whole book. The characters, while they're not necessarily great, it's just such a bonkers experience. Like I just couldn't put it any lower on the list. And for number 27, we have another Richard Bachman novel, Thinner. And this one's got a very fun premise of, this lawyer who runs over somebody, and they get a gypsy curse on them, and they just keep losing weight at a drastic rate. And it's such a fun premise. It's very goofy, and it's very fast-paced. I just love this book. Number 26 on the list is Song of Susanna, which is Dark Tower Book 6. And I think this is easily the most underrated Dark Tower novel. I know a lot of people cite this as the worst Dark Tower novel, and they think it's all filler and it's not as good as the other ones. I highly disagree. I think this book gets super meta and super weird, and I just love it for what it is. And while there are 2 more Dark Tower novels that I do love more than this one, I think this one is super underrated. Sneaking into the top 25, we have a new addition to the list, which is Billy Summers. I loved this book. Not perfect, but I do think the character of Billy Summers is a super underappreciated protagonist from Stephen King. I love him. One of the better Stephen King protagonists that we've gotten in the last 20 years or so. And I love the premise of the assassin for hire, like on his last job. And just a lot of things really clicked for me in this book. I really enjoy it. Number 24, we have Just After Sunset. And this is, I think, my second favorite Stephen King short story collection. It's absolutely amazing. And while it is a short story collection, it actually has 3 novellas in here. And I think, if I remember correctly, I put all 3 of them in my top 10 Stephen King novellas. Overall, this short story collection is just awesome. And I'm definitely looking forward to reading it for the Stephen King Short Story Book Club. Another shameless plug. But yeah, Just After Sunset is awesome. For 23, we have another Richard Bachman novel, and that would be Blaze. So this is my second favorite Richard Bachman novel. This one is very sad and just a very good and gripping character study. Not a lot happens in this book, which is probably why a lot of people don't love this book. But I think it's one of Stephen King's best character studies. One of my favorite Richard Bachman novels, Blaze. Number 22, we have Later, which again is one of Stephen King's newest books and also one of his best. It's very short, very quick to read, very good character. It's not a lot that I don't love about this book, although the very ending, there's kind of something thrown in that kind of demotes it down just a tiny bit. But overall, very cool story. I love the characters. I love the directions that it takes with the premise. And yeah, just one of his better newest releases. Number 21, just missing my top 20, is Eyes of the Dragon. And this book just feels very nostalgic for me. It's very vastly different from any other Stephen King book. It's kind of written as if it's like a middle grade or YA book at times. But overall, it's very good, very entertaining, very cool fantasy story. And it's definitely one of my favorites. So Eyes of the Dragon, number 21. Now we're getting into my top 20. So all of these books I just absolutely love. And yeah, let's just get to it. Number 20 is The Outsider. This is a Stephen King book that I'm definitely looking forward to rereading eventually. I love this book. I love the premise, and I just love the directions that it goes in. It kind of switches gears like halfway through. A lot of the time, Stephen King fans don't love that, but oftentimes Stephen King, when he does that, I do love that. And overall, The Outsider is excellent. Number 20 on the list. Number 19, we have Finders Keepers, which is the second book in the Bill Hodges trilogy, and I absolutely love this one, although it's not perfect because it is in the Bill Hodges universe. I think this book would have been immensely better if it was just a standalone. But overall, just the way that the story is told, it's so gripping and so engaging. I love it. It gets demoted just a tiny bit because Bill Hodges and the gang is in it. But overall, still a fantastic book. Number 18, we have Dr. Sleep. And so I do actually enjoy this one more than The Shining. And this was actually one of the first Stephen King books I read way back when I first heard of its existence. When I originally did it, I liked The Shining more and Dr. Sleep slightly less. But each time I reread them now, I like The Shining slightly less and I like Dr. Sleep even more just because of the writing style, I believe, and the story. It just, everything in this book really clicks for me. So Dr. Sleep is definitely one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books. Number 17 on the list, Full Dark, No Stars. All of these stories are very dark in nature, just like the title suggests, and they're just so gripping. Some of my all-time favorite Stephen King novellas. I think Stephen King is actually at his best writing novellas. Number 16 on my list is Cujo. And while this is like a popular and well-known Stephen King story, it's weirdly underrated. A lot of people don't love this book, and I understand why, just because of the structure. There's no chapters, and the first half is kind of more literary, and you don't really get to the main meat and action of the story until the second half. But I just love getting to know all the characters in the first half of the story, and yeah, I just absolutely love this book. Number 15, you guys have probably been wondering if I've forgotten this book or like just what's happening, but I'm here to tell you that The Colorado Kid is awesome. Easily Stephen King's most underrated book. I absolutely love this. I know a lot of people hate this. A lot of people cite this as one of, if not his worst book, but I completely disagree. I love it. I love what he was going for, and I get that people hate not getting a clear-cut answer to the mystery in here, but that's the point. Oh man, I love this book, and you can't tell me otherwise. Number 14, we have The Wastelands, which is Dark Tower Book 3, and overall my second favorite Dark Tower novel. I love that we actually get some progression in this one, and just I love the bonker scenes that are layered throughout this book. Overall, just an excellent Dark Tower novel. Number 13 on the list, we have Carrie, and this is, of course, Stephen King's very first published novel. I think it's probably one of the best debut novels of all time. And even though I do love this book, it has fallen out of my top 10, and you'll see why, because there's some new additions to the top 10. Even if it's not in the top 10, I still love this book. 5 stars. I love Carrie White's character and her mom. Great villain. Just overall, the story just really does it for me. It's excellent. And number 12 on my list, we have Firestarter, and just like Carrie, this one also got bumped out of my top 10 and you'll see why. But overall, just still, I love this book. There's not really anything I would change about it. I love Charlie, and I love how this is one of Stephen King's best, or if not his best, sci-fi novel. And just, yeah, I absolutely love this book. Number 11, this will probably simultaneously confuse a lot of people, and for my longtime viewers, they will probably be happy that it's outside of my top 10 now. Number 11 is Roadwork. This is easily, well, not easily, but it is my favorite Richard Bachman novel. I know a lot of people hate this book, but man, I completely disagree. I think it's one of Stephen King's best character examinations. I eat this book up every time I read it. I love it so much, but it is number 11, so it's just outside of my top 10. So number 10 on my list, I will of course have to go with Night Shift, which is my all-time favorite Stephen King short story collection. And I pretty much love every single short story in this one. There might be one that I'm just like okay with, but pretty much all the rest of them are either great or excellent. And it's really hard to get a short story collection where you just really love or enjoy every single short story in here. This is definitely one of them. And overall, this is just one of my all-time favorite collections from anybody. Coming in at number 9 on the list, we have Needful Things, which is a new addition to the top 10. I think my last one, it was like just outside of my top 10, like at number 14 or 13. But it's been bumped up because I reread it in October for the Stephen King Readathon. And it just blew me away again, and I loved it even more the second time. I love the slow buildup of chaos that just reigns in the story. And I love the characters. I love the small town. Just everything just really clicks with this book. And it's one of Stephen King's best chunky books, and you know how much you guys know I don't love a lot of Stephen King chunky books, but this is definitely one of the best. Also a new addition to the top 10, number 8, we have Revival. Now I think originally I had this somewhere in the 20s. The main reason was because I knew I loved the beginning of the book, and I knew I loved the ending of the book. The middle section I couldn't quite remember, but upon a reread again for the Stephen King Readathon, I just absolutely loved this book, gave it 5 stars. It's just one of the best newer Stephen King books that he's written in probably the past decade or so. I loved all the musical stuff. I loved the characters. Just, again, everything clicked with me in this book. So Revival is number 8. And for number 7, also a new entry into the top 10, we have Dolores Claiborne. And man, this had a huge jump. I think this was originally in the 30s somewhere. And the first time I read it, I did enjoy it, but it took me a little bit. It took me a little bit to get into it. But I think the main reason why this had such a huge jump was because of the audiobook. The narrator really enhanced the story for me, and just I loved Dolores Claiborne as a character. Probably somewhere in my top 10 or top 5 Stephen King protagonist. I loved the story from start to finish. I love how funny it was. I love how it can go from being funny to sad. I just loved this book, and it's such a fresh addition to the top 10, I believe. So yeah, Dolores Claiborne, number 7. Number 6, we have Doomakey, which again is one of Stephen King's best of his newer books. I absolutely love it, and Edgar Freemantle is one of my all-time favorite Stephen King protagonists. I just love the story and how unique it is. Like most Stephen King stories take place in like a quarter environment, but this takes place in Florida. And I just loved the side character. One of the best friendships in here with Wireman. Just everything works for me. And it's just one of his best books. I wish more people would go and actually read it. And cracking into the top 5 here, at number 5, we have The Drawing of the Three, which is Dark Tower Book 2. And it is not easily my favorite because The Wastelands is still great. But it is my favorite Dark Tower book overall. I've read this book about 3 times now, at least. And somehow it just keeps getting better and better. I love the introduction to the new characters. I love how it's often funny at times and just how bonkers it is. It's such a unique story, and it's always been my favorite Dark Tower book, and it will probably remain so. Number 4 on the list, we have If It Bleeds. Absolutely loved this book, and especially so because it came at a very sad time in my life. My dad, who was a huge Stephen King fan, passed away like a few weeks before this was released, and the whole time I was reading it, I was basically just saying like, oh, he would just love this book. So I have, you know, that connection to it, but also just the novellas in here are just top notch. Like, like The Life of Chuck, one of my all-time favorite Stephen King novellas. Mr. Harrigan's Phone is also excellent. Rat, How It Ends, is excellent. So yeah, If It Bleeds, it's just excellent. And at number 3, we have my all-time favorite Stephen King novella collection, and just my favorite collection of his in general, and that would be Different Seasons, a perfect novella collection. Of course, you have Shawshank Redemption, or Rita Hayworth in Shawshank Redemption. You have The Body, you have Apt Pupil, and you have The Breathing Method, which is vastly underrated and probably one of, if not my favorite Stephen King novella of all time. So just 5 out of 5 stars for all of the novellas. I absolutely love this novella collection. Number 2 on my list is Misery. And this is probably my favorite horror novel of all time. And it's definitely one of, if not the scariest book that I've ever read. And I do really appreciate Stephen King's realistic horror more so than his supernatural horror, because I can more easily put myself into this scenario. And I just love this book every time I reread it. So yeah, it's number 2. And of course, there's only one book left, so probably no surprise to a lot of y'all. My number 1 spot, my all-time favorite Stephen King novel of all time, is The Dead Zone. Absolutely love this book. And for a long time, like when I first read it, like it was my favorite. And I actually didn't pick it up for a very long time until last October, during the October readathon. I actually made this like the bonus prompt for everybody, just because I wanted to read it and I wanted a lot of other people, I wanted y'all to read it. And yeah, I'm glad a lot of people had a great time with it. I know some people think it is overrated, but I don't. I absolutely love this book, and I'm so glad that upon a reread, it definitely solidified that it is my favorite Stephen King book. Absolutely love everything about this book. My number 1 favorite. All right, so that is my updated ranking of all of Stephen King's books. What did you guys think of my update here? Were you surprised by anything that might have changed? Were you surprised by any books that were so low on the list or that were so high on the list? What are your all-time favorite and least favorite Stephen King books? And if you want to do so, please leave down your ranking for the books that you've read down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the YouTube channel and the Book Astronomer Discord. And if you want to go support me financially, go check out my Patreon page. I also have my Amazon wish list if you'd like to buy me some books. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a fantastic day.